her 2019 debut novel, The Parisian, or Al-Barisi, Isabella Hammad traces the history of the Palestinian nation from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to its conflict with the British state and the early Zionist movement through the life of her great-grandfather, Midhat Kamal. Midhat, an affable bon vivant at heart, finds himself struggling to navigate the dual loyalty produced by his cosmopolitan French education and the increasingly grubby day-to-day struggles of life in a country not allowed to stand on its own 2 feet. Over the course of the narrative, Hammad attempts to understand the divisions within a person and what they can motivate them to do. Colonizer and colonized, passion and duty, faith and reason. All these forces push and pull at Midhat until he finally breaks. And what's left after that is, well, we get to it in the episode. Ben and I sat down to discuss The Parisian, putting it in conversation with the other historical novels we've discussed over the course of this season. We hope you enjoy our conversation.
Hello, dear listener. It's time for some book talk. You are now listening to the Infinite Library Podcast. I'm your host, Ben.
I'm your host, John.
And we're gathered here today to discuss the 2019 novel, The Parisian, by Isabella Hammad.
Yalla, Ben. Yanni, this was a book.
Yeah, John and I were saying that we're coming in a little middle of the road on this book for the first time. We had said before, we were like, nothing but bangers. We love this. And in this one, we were like, I mean, it's good, but we weren't blown away.
Yeah, I still think there's like plenty to talk about here that I think is interesting. So I don't worry, listeners. I feel like you're still going to get what you come here for. But this was definitely one that the parts I liked. The parts I didn't like, I really didn't like. And I think that there's just things going on with this book that I don't want to make this like a symptomatic case, but I feel like there's a lot in this book that kind of speaks to some trends and kind of like modern lit that, yeah, I'm not crazy about.
Yeah, and in terms of the historical novels that we kind of looked at thus far, because we should say that The Parisian is interested in basically retelling the story of Isabella Hammad's great-grandfather who traveled to Paris from Nablus, a town in Palestine. I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's Nablus.
Yeah, full disclaimer, listeners, we're probably going to butcher some pronunciations in this episode.
We beg your forgiveness.
There's French, there's Arabic. Ben and I speak neither.
Yeah, this is not a China pilled book like some of the ones we've talked about where we could get some of the pronunciations down. This one's a little we're not familiar, but he goes from a town Nablus to study medicine in a town in Paris, Montpellier, I think.
Montpellier.
Yeah, Plié, and things don't go well, basically. And then he eventually comes back to the Nablus in Palestine, and there is a sort of background context of more or less like Palestinian self-determination. And the author was, Isabella Hammad, was quoted as being interested in Palestinian history before the Nakba, which is a sort of like traumatic event that occurred basically in the history of the state. And so she wanted to tell a story before then. She kind of focused on her great-grandfather. And so I think this book makes an interesting comparison to the other historical novels we've looked at, which, Middlemarch, I kind of said was like a premier example of the genre. And then The Fraud was like Zadie Smith getting a little wild with it. And then By Night in Chile is one of, I would say, by some stretch of the definition of historical novel, but not really. And so I think putting The Parisian in conversation with those books, I think will lead to some interesting discussions about, what we like about the style of this book and what we don't. Because I think, as John was kind of hinting at, I think there's some features of this book that are very like MFA style, which we could talk about what works with that and what doesn't.
Yeah, just to provide a little context, listeners, this was a book that I picked when Ben and I were planning out kind of this season of the show. Uh, for those listening in the future, hopefully under better circumstances, we're currently about 6 or 7 months into a prolonged war on the people of Palestine by the Israeli state. And I really wanted to do something by a Palestinian author. The Parisian was a book I'd heard about that I heard was good, and focused on kind of this period in Palestinian history that does not get a lot of conversation. And so I thought it would be an interesting pick for the show. I stand by that. I still think this is an interesting book, even if it's not a book that I love the way I've loved some of the other books we've done for the show. But I just feel like that is important context here as we dig further into this novel and kind of what it's doing.
Yeah, I agree, John, and I'm sure we'll say it throughout the episode, but definitely free Palestine. So I think that deserves to be said. So
absolutely, Inverness Library stands with the people of Palestine.
And one thing that it's interesting that you brought that up, John. So she is currently working on stuff. She had a book recently published called Enter Ghost, which is also set in Palestine, about like Palestinians staging a production of Hamlet. And she gets kind of asked in interviews a lot about the situation in Palestine. And, she basically says what any normal person was, which is like, this is really horrible and we don't know how it's going to play out. And I find it interesting that like in these interviews, people are kind of looking to her for answers. And I think like, to me, that strikes me as an interesting sort of development in like the role of the novelist in terms of popular culture. Because I've told John this before, like, in the swinging 50s, like somebody like Saul Bellow would just get called into like business board meetings because people would say, oh, he's a novelist, he must know about everything. And whether or not he did, we can talk about that. But the novelist had sort of like a big swinging role in terms of like being a genius. And then sort of as I think American reading culture kind of gets devalued and starts fragmenting, we look to novelists for very like specialized, individualized answers. So Isabella Hammad being a Palestinian author, she's sort of looked to for knowledge about Palestine. And I think that's kind of interesting, a place where sort of novelists who have answers are. And one of the reasons we wanted to read this book was because like we wanted to read Palestinian literature. But I think that places the author in an interesting relationship to like what they're speaking for or what their sort of interests lie in telling like a historical story like this.
I agree with you, Ben. I think that I saw a tweet recently and I forgot to save it, and I'm kind of kicking myself right now. But it was basically someone kind of talking about why they think the novel is kind of in some depending on how you want to look at it, it's a somewhat decadent art form. I don't mean that in kind of the traditional sense of decadent, as in like champagne and gay sex, but decadent is in kind of like not vital, not progressing, like kind of stuck in this form that is no longer kind of moving with the culture. And this person kind of said that, in their opinion, the reason that is the case is that the novel for the longest time was a national document. Novelists were not just people telling stories, they were people who were seen as sort of curating, the language of a people in a time period. And, we see kind of the rise of the novel come with the rise of European nationalism in, the 17 and 1800s. And I think that as kind of America has eaten the world, there's a reason why the novel has kind of receded in at least the Anglophone world, because we don't have like a unique culture we're shepherding. We're just purveying the global monocultural slop. The places where the novel is still vital, if there are any, it's in places where that is not, there is still kind of a more vital, like local linguistic culture. But I do think it's interesting that Isabella Hammad, as kind of a Palestinian diaspora writer, is kind of being asked to channel this kind of earlier role of the novelist as this spokesperson for a nation in a very like direct sense. Like people weren't necessarily asking, who did you say earlier, Ben? Philip Roth?
Saul Bellow.
Saul Bellow, speak for America, please, Mr. Bellow, in the way that Hammad seems to be very directly being asked, like, will you tell us about Palestine and what's going to what is happening there and what's going to happen there?
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up something you said, John, because I think you could go even further back in terms of nationality and printing technology. Because when the printing press gets developed, that's when people start getting interested in national self-determination and like national history, national story. And like anytime basically you're looking at like when people started formulating like the idea of like a public nationality or like a community which you can belong to that is sort of imagined, the printing press is like right there. And so like that's kind of like a slightly different question for I think we want to talk about in this podcast, which is more about the literature itself. But I think if you wanted to, you could even take a step back further and say like the printing press is instrumental to having like a national sense of identity. And, the novel just happens to be like, one thing that happens as the result of a printing press. So
yeah.
But yeah, like one thing that I want to point out too about the way Isabella Hammad wrote this book is she did a lot of basically interviews in Nablus, Palestine. There's a quote from an interview and she says, "I basically said to anyone, if you have a grandparent with a good memory, I'd like to talk with them. She spent time with expended family members and others. Her grandmother came prepared with a philofax of names, including people with very, very vivid memories who remembered her great grandfather, who's the subject of the book. And basically, she supplemented these accounts with archival research and documents from British soldiers in the Middle East. So I think there's a sort of a lot of like almost ethnographic research that she did for this, which I think is also kind of speaks to the like idea of I am, representing this period of history that's not really talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like something with this book that I did appreciate is, and this is going to feel like a little bit trite, but I did get the sense of like, I don't want to say what it was like living through this period of time because a book will never fully give that to you. But I did feel like there was a real life to the place she was portraying. The majority of this book, despite the title, takes place in this town, which I get the impression it seems like it's kind of a medium-sized city in what would today be Palestine, but definitely seems like it's a little bit of like a backwater kind of in the broader like Arab Ottoman world.
Yeah, they mentioned it's situated between two mountains, so it didn't quite modernize along with other towns of the time. And the characters make multiple references to how like everybody knows each other's business. Yeah. So it's like small enough to be kind of like, everyone can know each other's business, but it's not quite big enough that they're modernizing along with every other town at the time.
Yeah, I definitely kind of got a little bit of that Middlemarch feeling of like, oh, I'm living in this town and like everyone's in each other's business. And I feel like I'm kind of like involved in like all these struggles like go back generations and people like and don't like each other for various reasons,
right?
That you become somewhat party to, but just kind of the way that I think feels very kind of odd in America in 2024. Like you don't really ever like, this is not really like the way like we've lived, I think, but definitely feel like I got kind of a peek into that world. And the town feels very vital, which I think is really interesting because I don't know about you, Ben, but I felt like a lot of the characters in this book never quite shaped up for me. Like I never felt like I got a great picture of any of the characters. And I think that's part of why this book left me a little cold. The setting feels very like rich and alive to me, but the characters felt a little flat and a little archetypal.
Yeah.
Which I think is a real weakness here.
I sort of agree too, because and we can get more into the plot. but occasionally like Midhat, the main character, the Parisian, Midhat Kamal is his name. Occasionally he makes a decision and I just don't know why he makes that decision. Like he'll make a decision, I'll just go, okay, I guess we're doing this now. Like, and like maybe again that might be because I wasn't entirely like in the book, but at the same time I was like, maybe this is also just sort of like, oh, characters do things in these kinds of novels and we don't necessarily have to provide the psychological minutia so we can understand them, but I did want more of that. So
well, it's kind of interesting because I think this novel's kind of working on like two levels. On the one hand, I think it kind of is selling itself when you like read the back cover, so to speak, when you read the dust jacket. It's selling itself as kind of like a pretty conventional like Bildungsroman. Like, oh, we're gonna watch this guy's like life, his like education, his development from like a young man into like a citizen. And kind of again this very like national context. Yeah. It's also Isabella Hammad writing about her real great-grandfather, who I don't know if she ever knew him personally, but presumably like she was talking to people in her family about him.
And he was somewhat of a local legend because he was one of the guys who got to go to France and study, and he became very refined. He's known for being into scarves and cologne. There's a great line later where the joke about the Parisian is like, I'm going to a bank, or whatever, like I'm going to, or you say bank in French in like a very like conceited way, which is honestly one of my favorite lines of the book because it was actually kind of like a bit of detail that spoke to the character. And, the guy who's talking about that detail, one of his cousins who doesn't really like him, who doesn't really like Midhat because he's not politically motivated, was like, I always felt like Midhat was sort of pretending to be this refined guy when he wasn't really. And sort of the refined, the Parisian, the sort of Palestinian abroad character is kind of like this act that he puts on. And I think like Hammad spends a lot of time sort of probing why he does that and how it can sort of relate to kind of like this split consciousness where you are a foreigner and you go to another country and everybody treats you weirdly. And so you kind of pretend to be somebody to deal with that. And as a result, you feel kind of alienated.
And then you come home and everyone there treats you like you're a stranger because all of a sudden you're refined, you're cultured in a way that they're not. And like there's a not so subtle resentment of that
and
fact.
Too, this is when Palestine is becoming self-determinizing. They sort of see his Parisian affectation as kind of like a, I guess what's the word? Sort of like getting a little too into the colonizer mindset as opposed to like, the Palestinian mindset, the one that's kind of coming to be born.
Yeah. So I wonder about that from the standpoint, like I imagine that if I tried to write a novel about my own great grandfather, I don't know what that story would even be off the top of my head, but I feel like I would be hesitant to delve too deeply into like his personal psychology because on the one hand, like I'm a product of that psychology. On the other hand, like I'm trying to tell again, this very personal story that really it feels like should be getting into this stuff, but it almost feels like there's just something in that closeness that is always kind of keeping her sort of at a remove from him. He kind of has to remain a mystery because he's not a character on one level. He's like a real person. And I almost feel like maybe it would have been a little safer to tell a story about a different person who's inspired by her great grandfather, but maybe just has a little more of a remove. But now that I'm saying that, I'm thinking about there's the story kind of at the beginning of part 2 where she actually gets into a bit more of her family history, specifically her great great grandfather, who kind of has this very like roundabout adventure where he's like summoned to basically like he kind of gets like a Kafka-esque like trial notice, and he's like he's going to like he gets like summoned to go to court in like the like local capital. He leaves, he finds out basically like, oh, if he goes there, they're gonna kill him. And so he like disguises himself as like a farmer and like kind of slowly meanders like back to his home village, along the way like marrying 3 women, like so that he has a place to stay. And then apparently like for the next like several years he's just kind of like making a circuit between like all his wives.
Yeah, and this is against the context of like sort of, I think, the Ottoman Empire like encroaching in the areas that he was supposed to go at. So he was sort of worried that the Turks would basically kill him being a Palestinian. But yeah, he marries multiple people, and they're like sort of rest stops for this like circuitous journey.
Yeah, like he'll stop off at like a farm and he'll be like, "Can I stay here tonight?" And the guy who owns the farm will be like, "Eh." And he'll be like, "I see you have a daughter. What if I married her?"
And then the guy's like, "Okay." Yeah, like, yeah.
And then he's like, "Oh, all right."
Also, there's like that kind of tense
that, like,
scene where like he's trying to like smooth talk his way past a Turkish officer to like get a message on the telephone, and he's just like waiting for the telegram, basically, like with the Turkish guy, like pretending to be somebody else.
But yeah, I really liked that section. It kind of had this like folktale-ish element. Like it felt like the type of story you would kind of tell about this like legendary like member of your family, and kind of like, oh, let me tell you about how, you know, your great grandfather ended up with 4 wives like all over the country. And it's interesting. Like again, it's at the same like kind of level of the remove. Like we don't spend a ton of time like in the head of her great grandfather, kind of getting into like his personal like feelings, unlike, or like psychology. Yeah. But because it kind of has that remove, it's able to do it. And I feel like this book is kind of, it's trying to do 2 things that it kind of can't do at once. On the one hand, it's trying to be, like I said, like a Bildungsroman. It's trying to be like the story of this one guy. And then on the other hand, like it wants to, kind of be involved in this national personal myth making. And it just kind of can't quite get that alchemy.
Yeah, and
together.
A lot of the kind of close emotional observation of Midhat, not his great grandfather, is when he's kind of just interacting with people in Montpellier. How do you pronounce it? Montpellier. So a lot of so the close emotional observational stuff is used for Montpellier, and it kind of makes sense. But at the same time, like, I don't particularly like that style of writing. Like obviously when you read it, you're drawn in, but there's a lot of like descriptions of like eye contact and like moments where you try to get closer to somebody and they misunderstand you, and then that person like pulls back, and there's like a lot of that, and I don't particularly like that stuff. And I have like a sort of spiel about that I can get into, but that's the kind of like writing I associate with kind of like MFA workshop stories. But then like that's juxtaposed with what John is saying with like this sort of like folktale aspect, this kind of like, you know, received wisdom from people that she interviewed that she incorporates into the setting. And so as the result, the setting kind of comes to me a lot stronger than the interactions of Midhat and his actions as well, which, as I was saying, sometimes happen and I don't know why. And to me, like, if we're juxtaposing with Middlemarch, which may be a little unfair, I think with George Eliot, she's like, to me, a lot better at ratcheting between like the environment and the interior consciousness. And like, it's so easy to pull back and forth, and each person like reacts in a way that's perfectly understandable. And they also like talk in a way that's like distinctive. And I don't know, there's like very close attention to the characters in their environment in Middlemarch, which like obviously Isabella Hammad is doing, but there's more of like, you could tell when she's shifting gears, I guess. It's like, it's sort of apparent when the gears being shifted.
Well, like, so again, I agree with you. Maybe Middlemarch, it's a little unfair to compare anyone to Middlemarch.
True.
But I think that like Middlemarch, it always felt so effortless when we would transition from one character to another. And, you know, it really did feel like, oh, there is no like true protagonist of this book. Like we're really following this community. And again, I think that it's this tension in this book between these kind of 2 modes of storytelling it's trying to do. There are several times over the course of this book where we do switch perspectives for a little bit. will leave Midhat's mind and will be in we kind of follow this kind of abstracted kind of folktale story of the great great grandfather, or we'll be following this French priest who is kind of based in Nablus doing ethnographic research, or we'll follow Midhat's cousin Jamil as he's kind of involved in this military action against the British forces in the Palestinian Mandate territory. But it always, those shifts always feel much more, they always feel like a little clunky. Like you never shift into these people enough that you actually feel like they really tie into the narrative. Well, it always feels like we kind of just come crashing back into Midhat's perspective in a way that always feels like a little bit like too heavy.
Yeah. And too, like, he is not politically active, and a lot of the surrounding characters are, like Jamil and who is, I need to look up his name. There's the cousin who is politically active, like not the cousin, his like name is Haj, I think.
Hani Murad.
Hani Murad is like the most politically active compared to Jamil, but and so and obviously that's a choice that happened as a result of, I think, probably maybe her actual grandfather not being politically active, but I don't know. To me, that kind of leads to the clunkiness a little bit, and like, I know. So this is somewhat related, but I know a couple Syrians, and you know, the Syrians hate getting asked to sort of like do the thing that we were talking about, or it's like you'll ask a Syrian like, oh, what's going on with Syria today, and they'll just be like, I don't have to tell you anything. And so like I can sort of see where kind of perhaps Midhat's reluctance to kind of get politically involved makes sense, you know, because that's just the diversity of human experience, and like not everyone has to be a spokesperson for, you know, what's going to happen and what is happening politically. And so I sort of identified that in some people I know from Levantine, but yeah, I don't know, like that kind of leads to some of the friction, I think, between the historical setting and Midhat as a character. Can we talk about the priest character? Because I was getting some real big By Night in Chile vibes from his character. And like, obviously he's not so much as like an annoying asshole as Yurti LaCroix is, but he ends up basically being a servant to power, even though he's like upset about not doing that. And I thought that was an interesting character to have in the background of this. And we don't have to jump to this, but Midhat kind of like has a final confessional scene with this priest at the end of the book that ends everything. And I thought it was interesting that she decided to pair Midhat with the priest, but also like the priest's sort of story of being a servant to power was like an interesting, like, you know, I would say maybe like complementary note to the characters that are described here.
I agree. I thought I really enjoyed his sort of the scenes that kind of follow him. I think he's an interesting character. So his name is Father Antoine. He is not a missionary. He is actually, like, when he enters the novel, he is basically in Nablus doing ethnographic research for a French university in Jerusalem. The University Bibliothèque, I think is what it's called. I don't know a ton about this institution off the top of my head, but it's a French university run by the, you know, somehow through the Catholic Church in Jerusalem. So basically he is in Nablus to study kind of local customs and the local language. And he kind of bumps into Midhat a couple times over the course of the novel. And yes, the story kind of ends with Midhat kind of having this confessional with him, not like a formal confessional in like the Catholic sacramental sense, but that is obviously kind of what is going on metaphorically, I guess we'd say.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, Ben. One thing I did think is really interesting in this book is I think it does a really good job kind of laying out the way that, like, the acquisition of knowledge is never like a wholly like altruistic thing. Like there's always a reason to you're doing this, as much as like you can tell yourself that you're doing it just because you have a passion to like learn. So
to study.
There's kind of a lot made in this book of the friction, not just the friction that like Midhat kind of embodies between like the colonized subject and like the colonizing world, but also just kind of like the opposite, the way that the colonizing force like struggles to make sense of the thing it's trying to colonize.
So along those lines, like Father Antoine is clearly paired with the father of the host family that Midhat ends up staying with, who is an anthropologist. Yeah, and he basically ends up like very weirdly attempting to study Midhat, who's staying in his own home. Also, the scenes where he's talking with his colleague, he sounds like a really bad academic. And like I like he would be like just doing something, and I'll be like, oh man, that reminds me of like when I start making like a dumb claim, and my advisor's like, what are you talking about? It's like you know, like his friend is clearly a better academic than he is. But anyway, like he ends up trying to like really weirdly study Midhat, and what sort of precipitates Midhat leaving his host family's home is that he comes across the notes that the father of the host family was making of him, as if he was a scientific study. And that's like paired with, as you were saying, John, Father Antoine, who's like, I'm just going to study this small town and see how it functions. And then at some point during the Palestinian, you know, self-determination, he gets asked to basically inform. and he's like, oh, I don't know about it. And then he just ends up doing it. Like, so. Yeah,
well, he writes a book on Nablus.
Yeah, 15 which seems years like of study.
It kind of ends up becoming a source for the British military to basically like understand this area.
Yeah.
And the way he kind of talks about the town is kind of contrasted with these nuns who are also active in the area, and who he kind of has this fairly like complicated relationship with. They're again, I don't know if they're formally missionaries from the standpoint. It doesn't really seem like they're trying to convert anyone, but they're basically there to do medical charity work.
Yeah.
And a lot is made of the fact that like they really try to learn the language and like dress in a way that like the locals will understand. Like they wear Arabic clothing, they try to speak Arabic, whereas Father Antoine kind of seems more like a foreigner.
Yeah.
And you know, the way he kind of talks about Nablus is in this very like kind of fetishistic way. He talks about how he really loves the town because it has kind of remained in stasis in this way that like makes it easier for him to study. You know, he can't go to Jaffa or Cairo and like study these places the same way because they're modernizing too fast, and he's losing the kind of crystallized like cultural aspects that he's so interested in studying.
Very quaint.
Yeah. And again, it's just interesting because again, he is someone who he does like have this love of the culture in this abstract sense. Like he does like have this very sincere interest in like Levantine culture and Arabic language. And, you know, he's like an academic, like he seems like he's a good academic, unlike Molyneux, the anthropologist that Midhat stays with in Montpellier. But he still is hampered by the fact that he is not there like as an apolitical person. You know, he is there for a reason. You know, they kind of explain how he ends up in the Levant. I guess at some point, I don't know enough about this exact period in like French history to say exactly what's going on, but I guess there was a point in the 1800s or early 1900s when a lot of priests were expelled from France, and so he kind of ends up in the Levant based on that. So again, he's kind of forced out of the mother country and, you know, sort of used not as a settler, but kind of fulfilling a somewhat analogous role, like getting plopped in this place, kind of to be an intelligence agent. Not wittingly, but in a very real sense.
This is partly why, this comes with my problem with the book. That's a really cool, like, character and a cool situation. But the way he becomes his intelligence officer is, like, related to some, like, emotional misunderstanding with this nun that he has a fraught relationship with. And I was just sort of, like, irritated that, like, I mean, sure, that happens all the time. But, like, the way his, like, turn is, you know... And By Night in Chile, you get this like great picture of like, this like complicit guy. And in this one, he's just like, he's trying to talk to the nun. And then the nun says, don't inform. It's not worth it. And he thinks about that interaction and he goes, that means she did inform. And so then he ends up like, you know, deciding to inform. And it's like based on like an emotional misunderstanding that like is sure that's true to life. But that being like the crux is kind of irritating to me. Like I don't know. I don't feel like I know him. I just see him like miss an emotional cue and then decide to be an informer, I guess.
Well,
I don't know.
I think that part of it is that I think we're reading into this based on kind of our personal interests and kind of the reading we're putting this book in conversation with By Night in Chile.
Yeah.
And again, just kind of our probably just interest in kind of knowledge generation and intelligence
and like weirder prose styles too.
Yeah. But the book, like we're definitely kind of pulling this out of the book. This does not feel like something that is really brought to the fore in the text a lot.
It's not.
Yeah. Like I feel like we're like it's there, but we're kind of having to tease this out more than I think Hammad does herself. And I think that to kind of explain what I mean here, I think that kind of this theme is brought out a lot more elegantly in a different scene in the book where it's describing the British occupation of Jerusalem. And it's describing how the British troops basically cannot get like a reliable map of the city because it's just too old. There's too many alleys. Everything is just too complicated and tangled up. And this is kind of before, I guess, they could get kind of aerial imaging to get like an accurate layout of what things look like. So, you know, there's kind of this descriptions of like these British troops, like kind of trying to piece together a map of this again, ancient city.
Yeah.
And just kind of not being able to. And like the fact that they can't understand where they are is like kind of how the Palestinian resistance is kind of able to get the upper hand temporarily on them. And I think that is a much more kind of elegant display of the same theme in a way that the Father Antoine storyline just never quite gets there. And I think that some of that is, again, I think that you could do like a whole book on Father Antoine.
Yeah.
But it's wrapped up in this wider narrative, and he never gets enough time to breathe as a character where you really can get a sense for like his motivations, his conflicts with like what he's doing. You know, the stuff about him informing, that's all basically told with him just telling another character that happened. Like we don't see it happen. We don't actually follow like his experience of that. We hear him tell somebody else about that, and it just doesn't quite work.
Yeah, and I think too, like I could see Father Antoine as sort of like a commentary on the idea of like a narrator character for historical novels, because like, you know, there's somebody who's maybe telling the scope of history, like the authorial voice. But I think like, you know, with Father Antoine, it's clearly like suspect, and it's related to the kind of like, you know, the colonizing need to like represent this culture in like terms that it can understand. Like you were saying about the map of Jerusalem. So like, Yeah, and I think, and again, like Hamad's clearly more interested in Midhat than she is in Father Antoine, but I don't know, I don't like that. Yeah, Father Antoine just tells somebody he's informing now, and it's based on an emotional understanding, and I was like, all right, like I guess, you know, again, it's fine, it's not bad, it's rendered well, it's just not something that's my personal inclination, I guess.
So I feel like we have been a little harsh thus far. Do we want to talk about maybe some of what we did like about the book?
Yes. I find that Midhat's relationships with other people in Nablus is quite good, and I like the scene where all the guys are like hanging out at the coffee shop, like reading the newspaper and like talking about women. Like there's some nice like sort of quotidian details there that I like, and I think his sort of the way he kind of interacts with his friends, and the way he even interacts with his friends in when he moves to Paris after he flees. Where does he go from Montpellier?
He goes to Paris.
Oh, he goes to Paris.
That's why he's the Parisian.
I thought I misremembered. Yeah, clearly he's not the Montpellieran. But yeah, so he goes to Paris, and like he's like the political conversations you have, I think those are all rendered really well. And to me, that's a little bit better than the kind of like emotional miscommunications that, like, for instance, he's always having with Jeanette, who we've not talked about. But I want to focus on the positives. So I think those interactions are great. And I also like that the way that history kind of intrudes on the characters, because it feels very natural and it feels motivating as well. So I think like those two things worked really well for me. I did like those.
Yeah, I agree with you. Kind of on terms of the character interactions, I think that Hammad does a very good job with dialogue.
Yeah.
I think something that's really interesting in the book that I'm still kind of trying to puzzle out exactly like why she chooses to do what she does. So obviously this is an English novel. 99.9% of the text is in English. I don't know that there's actually a single point in the book where any of the characters were speaking English to each other.
Right.
Because obviously we're primarily dealing with French and Arabic speaking people. I think there's one character I know for sure speaks English, and it's Midhat's wife, and I don't know that he speaks English, so I don't know that they are speaking English to each other. But Hammad does something really interesting where she will not translate certain words or even like whole sentences.
Yeah.
And I think that it really kind of, it always kind of put me on my back foot a little bit. You know, there are some times where it comes across just like a little bit of color. You know, she's working with words, especially in the Arabic. You know, I kind of pulled two out in her intro. Yala and Yani, which I get the impression are somewhat verbal filler, more or less.
Yeah.
But there are. Maybe that's not quite the best way to put it, but there are words that maybe are a little hard to find like an exact analog for in English.
Right.
Whereas the French, I always felt like there was something a little more, I don't say obviously it's deliberate regardless, but the French always came across as a little bit more, I always felt like there was a little more of a mystery in why she was choosing to do that. Like it always feels like there's kind of a weight to the French bits that I'm still puzzling out for myself. So kind of, I guess it's kind of the climax of the book. Midhat finds a letter that has been kept from him for years, and this letter not getting to him has really like shaped the course of his life over the course of like, I would guess like a decade and a half at that point.
Yes, I think he says something to that effect. Yeah.
Yeah. And he finds this letter and he has like a complete like nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
And he is shrieking and like like inconsolable with grief. And his friend Hani comes to him and he's speaking French to Hani.
Yeah.
And he says like je suis complètement lucide. Un lucide absolu. Qu'est-ce que c'est cette fois? Folie. It's been a long time since I did French, but he's saying like, I'm completely lucid. This is an absolute lucidity.
Yeah, that's how I interpret that. He's like, yeah, I'm totally lucid, and he's clearly not. Yeah.
No, he's lapsed into this language that he earlier, in that same chapter, there's a bit where he comes across like a French book and he's like struggling to read it. Like he's clearly like having like a break, and the fact that he slips into French is symbolic of that. Like it's kind of the point, I think, where his dual consciousness becomes the most pronounced. And of course, it's the part where he goes temporarily insane.
And he strikes Hani. It's revealed later. And when we get some of his interior monologue when he's in a psychiatric ward, he talks about there being 4 Midhats. That's what he says. Like, he's like, there are 4 Midhats and I could be any one of them. Or so like, yeah, he's like kind of doing that. But I think like from his character perspective, it's like, so he had this relationship with the daughter of the host family. And in the scene where he confronts the father about the father taking weird notes about him, Jeanette does not stand up for him. And so he ends up kind of leaving. And then, Jeanette's like, I miss you. Please come back. Like, we could make this work. And his father, Midhat's father, withholds this letter from him, I think, realizing that he had an intimate relationship and that the intimate relationship will draw him away from the textile business, which is what he's supposed to inherit from his father, Midhat's father. So when he finally comes across this letter, it's like, it sort of confirms to him that, yeah, he could have gone something else. He could have not been in Nablus, and he could have had this romantic relationship that he was sort of, again, was the one, I guess. He thinks she's the one. And yeah, that leads to him sort of like, literalizing the kind of double consciousness break.
Yeah, it's something that it's interesting when I look kind of back at this novel. This is a pretty hefty book. This is my edition is 550 pages.
Yeah.
And then like a appendix or two of like a timeline of historical events and things. But the part in France and then this bit with the letter all takes place in like the first 200 pages.
Yeah.
And I honestly kind of felt a little disappointed that basically that like we end up in Nablus for so long, and then like all this stuff kind of comes out at the very end. And I kind of was hoping that there was going to be a little more push and pull between these two places. And I guess I think there is in the background, but Hammad does not bring it to the forefront in a way that feels like it lives up to like kind of what it feels like it should.
Yeah, because a lot of the push-pull is usually just Midhat sort of retaining some kind of affectations, like the scarves and the cologne and the kind of interest in like French fashion.
And he smokes and drinks and like he clearly like has, he clearly like is someone who thinks of himself as kind of a sophisticate and a bon vivant.
Yeah.
And he feels kind of trapped in this little town. But, I keep thinking about like the title of the book. It's like, it's the Parisian.
Yeah.
And I'm like, we're in Paris for like 30 pages. And then it really never feels like going back to Paris is a real like option pretty quickly. And like there's the bit where he gets back from Paris and his father's like, if you go back to Europe, I'm disowning you.
Right.
And he like frets about that for like 50 pages, and then he never really until like he finds this letter, it never really seems like it's the thing that he is seriously considering. And I kind of wish that again, like we'd seen a little more of the turmoil. Like there's like maybe one or two other mentions where like his wife he marries kind of the sheltered daughter of this wealthy family in the town.
Yeah, Fatima.
and she asks like, "Can we go to Paris?" And he's like, "Maybe." But again, it's almost said offhandedly, and it never feels like this thing that he wants to do or that she really wants to do.
Well, don't they go abroad in like the 30s, like before stuff starts happening in Palestine?
Do they?
Yeah, because isn't there a scene where like Midhat sees one of his old friends, and then they both like look at this woman at the bar, and they're like, "Oh," and then but then Midhat's like, "I'm comfortable in my marriage. I don't need to chase this woman." Like, I think they do go a little bit, but it's sort of like. I got the impression it was very like, well, maybe it was in the 30s. I got the impression it was very like kind of roaring 20s little like kind of like, things are doing good. You know, like I get to see a little bit of Europe. Everything's great. And then like, yeah. And then, but it's like not really satisfying.
Yeah. I think that when I read the title, like I expected the push and pull between kind of Paris specifically, not just kind of Europe more broadly, but Paris like as a specific place.
Yeah.
To really feel like it was going to be this thing that's really drawing on this character. And I think that Hammad wants us to think that it is, but I don't think she does a great job actually portraying that.
Oh, okay. He doesn't go to Europe. The scene that I'm thinking of, he's back from Iraq.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's at the King David Hotel, and then he sees Hani there. So yeah, so they travel to Iraq, but not Paris or Europe. So yeah.
And like it's okay if like they never go back to Paris, but again, I never get the impression. I think part of my problem with it is that like what is actually causing his split consciousness?
Yeah.
I don't think we ever actually get to that because Midhat is kind of raised in Nablus by his grandmother. And then at a pretty early age, he's sent to Istanbul to attend a boarding school.
Yeah.
And then he goes to Montpellier. He's only in Paris for a year. And I'm not saying that like he had to be in Paris for like a long time for it to be important to him. But again, it's like I don't feel like there's a great case for this split consciousness when he's been all over the place. Like it just doesn't feel like he is tied into these things strongly enough for it to be pulling him apart that way. And it feels like his relationship with Jeanette is kind of supposed to be filling in for a lot of the psychological weight that I feel like Europe more broadly should have for him. Like, I feel like there should be more about the things he likes doing in Europe. All we really kind of get the impression is that he loves Jeanette, and then when he's in Paris, he sleeps with a bunch of prostitutes.
Well, he's sort of like this kind of man about town, and he like attends these sort of political meetings, and he learns to kind of talk about politics, but he doesn't really do anything. And then apparently he loved basically, so he leaves the medical degree in Montpellier, and in Paris he basically just reads like philosophy and
history and philosophy.
Yeah. And he apparently loves that stuff, but we never really hear about that. So
yeah, and again, and I think that that's what really just doesn't work for me here, is that I want to know, like, what is this guy actually torn up about? Like,
yeah, he reads the letter and then it just kind of happens. Yeah.
Well, it feels like we're supposed to basically take his relationship with Jeanette is supposed to be this kind of stand-in for this European life that we're supposed to understand that he wants, but we don't see enough of what he likes about Europe and like why it would appeal to him over Nablus to really buy that conflict.
And, you know, Farouk is kind of like a vision of him if he didn't return to Nablus, where Farouk is this tutor that he meets who kind of shows him the ropes, and he ends up staying with Farouk, and Farouk never marries, and he's always, you know, dating some woman or something. Like,
And yeah, like, I feel like, again, we get like these archetypes that just never quite flesh out enough for me to really get that deep appreciation that I feel like I need to buy this narrative.
Yeah. And you know, I mean the book does cover a lot, as we said, a lot of characters, a lot of history, a significant chunk of time. And it sort of kind of makes sense that it's gonna fall back a little bit on stock characters, like Farouk and Jeanette and things like that. But yeah, at the same time, it's like I'd like it would be nice if there's like a little more complexity, I guess.
Well, I think that it would be fine if Midhat was more of a character.
Oh, yeah.
But he never really develops into anything. Like, again, I feel like it's not so much that we're just told things about him, but he, like you said earlier, Ben, like he does things and we don't really understand why he does them.
Okay. Can we talk about the first example? So he gives Laurent the watch.
So Laurent,
I wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, Laurent is a friend of his. He's a fellow medical student in Montpellier, and he's kind of the first like person who treats Midhat as like a peer.
Yeah,
when he's in France,
and they like hang out. They go to a garden. He says like he says funny stuff that's sort of like in a kind of like thinking out loud way, and like Midhat is like really appreciative of his friendship.
Yeah, and he gets called off to go serve in World War I as a surgeon. And before he leaves, Midhat gives him this pocket watch that his father had gifted to him, as kind of a show of trust before he left for Europe. And
he just kind of gives it to Laurent. And I guess it's like in appreciation of the friendship, but when it happened, I was like, oh, I guess he's doing that. And I didn't really know why.
Well, I kept thinking like, genuinely, my first thought when I read that scene was like, am I supposed to read this as like he's gay? Like it felt like it kind of had this like romantic reading to it.
Yeah.
Or like he's doing it because it's like, I don't know. I feel like if I was writing that scene, I would be like, oh, he'd like read a novel where somebody did this. And like he's kind of trying to like behave in this certain way because he's in Europe and he's going to like try to behave like the way people like in the novels he's read.
The gesture.
Act. Yeah. He's doing this kind of grand gesture that's on one level like very silly, but on the other hand, like very earnest and genuinely affectionate. But it just kind of feels out of nowhere.
I guess he's supposed to be drunk too.
Yeah.
And then it's described in the morning. He's like reaching out for the watch and he has to hit the table like 3 times before he realizes that he gave it away, which to me like suggests that there's some kind of like regret that he did that. So I don't know.
Well, and then like he comes back and there's one scene where the father's like, where's the watch? And he's like, oh, it broke. I had to take it to the watch fixer.
Yeah, like I mean, his relationship with his father is fraught. So I guess he couldn't say like, "Hey, I gave it to like the only real friend I had in the beginning." Yeah, I don't know. It's something that happens in like, yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead.
It feels like it's this thing where it's supposed to be this really weighty symbol, but it comes up like twice in the whole book.
Right. Yeah, it comes up twice in the whole book, and also like I didn't have enough context for Midhat to explain that action to me. Like I wasn't like he doesn't do that when we see him, and he does that up until that point. So clearly it's like, oh, his friend means a lot to him. But yeah, it comes out of nowhere, and I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. Like him leaving though makes sense. And then there's another thing that I was thinking of where I was like, I wasn't sure why Midhat did that either.
Well, I think that, so him leaving Montpellier makes sense, but it only makes sense because basically it is the most like abject thing that he could find out is happening. Like he finds out that he's basically being treated like a caged ape by this racist like French anthropologist.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, yeah, he leaves because obviously he would. There's no subtlety to it. It's literally the most like hitting you over the head with what's going on thing. And like, that's fine. You can do that.
Yeah.
But I think that the fact that that's the one time in the book where it really feels totally clear to me, like what his motivations are, kind of highlights the problem. It's like, if I can only tell what he's thinking and why he's doing something when it's literally the most like cartoonish like le racism.
Well, what did you think about too when like they're like, oh, Laurent had a thing with Jeanette, and then it's like Midhat like hated Laurent in that moment, and then also like he wishes that Laurent would get killed, and then when Laurent does get killed, he feels like a ton of remorse, and that remorse then like comes back when he's in the psych ward and he's like thinking about it.
Again, like I that was another time where I was like, again, am I supposed to like be reading that he's kind of secretly gay for Laurent? Like, there's just this weird ambivalence to it where I felt like there was this weight to it that, again, I never quite understood why. And again, like I feel like it's another time where like basically Laurent is killed in, not even in the war, like he's on leave and he gets in like a fight with a drunk guy at a bar and gets stabbed.
Yeah, it's a really horrible way to go out.
Yeah, just really pointless and tragic, which I guess World War One. But
yeah,
like he basically kind of, that's how he ends up with Jeanette, is like they're both mourning Laurent, and like that's kind of how they develop this much more like intimate relationship.
Right.
But again, it feels like another time where it's like, okay, I don't really get what he likes about Jeanette. I don't really get like why she likes him.
Well, no, he likes Jeanette, and maybe I'm overtly simplifying it, but like Jeanette treats him like a normal person at the party, and like you can like, and again, that comes back to me like, I don't know, the MFA style of sort of rendering characters as picking up on minute emotional cues is something I don't like. and I'm sure like obviously it happens in real life and it is something that's real, but that depicted that particular rendering of reality is one that I don't particularly enjoy. But he likes Jeanette because they're at this party and she actually treats him like a human being and not like this strange foreigner who's visiting. And like there's a description where it's like Midhat's chest thawed was something that like is the text says, and I'm like, oh great, it's a meet cute. It's an MFA meet cute where you see somebody is perceiving you for who you are or something. Like, I don't know. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think my issue is basically the same as yours, just worded a little bit differently. Like, I think for me, it's just like that is not enough for me to buy this as like a real relationship.
Yeah, I'd like to just read a quick quote. Now, Sam Criss is not the best authority, but I do find that Sam Criss has some interesting writing on this subject, so I'd just like to read this quote real quick about this style of writing. There's a close attention to sensory detail and an even closer attention to minor affective nuances, moments of inattention or miscommunication, people who see each other as more or less than they actually are, small eddies of desperation or loneliness or regret. There's a lot of banal but realistically rendered dialogue. They gesture towards a kind of emotional hyperliteracy. If the author is showing off about something, it's how much they see, how well they understand the social pitfalls of ordinary life. Now, I won't get into his critique, but I have that, like, to me, I think that description is quite kind of what's going on. So, at least with Jeanette and Midhat's relationship, because I feel like the dialogue that is done, elsewhere, the dialogue to me is better. And then the kind of interactions that he has with Jeanette, it seems like it's just that. So,
yeah, no, I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's certainly a style of writing, and people like it, and it is true to life. I don't particularly enjoy it. So, like, oh, great! Now the characters are making eye contact again. This is important. You know, like.
I think that what you're saying is interesting, Ben. You know, I think what I keep coming back to with this book is that it's, again, I don't want to like put this book like on a pedestal, so to speak. Maybe that's not quite the word. I don't want to act like this book is like symptomatic necessarily. I don't know that like the Parisian is what's wrong with literature. That's not what I want to say at all.
Yeah.
But I do think that kind of what you're saying about like the MFA style, there is kind of this issue today where it's like people get degrees in writing novels.
And in that particular style.
Yeah.
And I think, well, actually, I do kind of want to mention the critique just real quick, because he says, if literature is not only a reproduction of social existence, but a site in the production of subjectivity, then this form is a machine for creating paranoiacs. So like you're constantly just like, oh, did I miss that emotional cue? Is that what's happening? Like did I not respond to this invitation the correct way? Like, yeah, it just I don't know. That sounds like having an anxiety breakdown. And I mean, she did get trained she did get an MFA degree. Now, like, you know, there are certainly MFA people that write in different ways, and not all MFA degrees write the same way. But yeah, to me, I was just kind of like, this is. Yeah, I don't know. I don't particularly like this.
Well, I think what I was going to say was that.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
What this novel feels like to me, it feels so conventional. Like it feels like the type of novel you're taught to write in an MFA program, and the point, like, there are points where you can feel her kind of straining against that training. But she never can quite get out of it enough to really do something bold enough to make the choices work. Again, like kind of with the shifting perspectives we were talking about earlier, I think that there is a version of this novel where she does something a little more Middlemarchy, and it's a little bit less about Midhat specifically, and it's more about the town. And we follow his grandmother and, you know, his father-in-law and his cousin and the Samaritan tailor who works for them.
Yeah, Eli, definitely an interesting guy. We don't see enough of him.
Yeah.
So,
you know, again, like the points in this book that really worked for me were the points where it's more about the setting. You know, like I loved the scene where his grandmother makes him go visit, like there's this Samaritan community in Nablus, and I guess basically everyone thinks they're wizards.
Yeah, they think they have like powerful sort of magic.
Yeah,
basically.
even though they're not Muslim, so their religion isn't like the truth. If you need like a love spell, you have to like go visit like a Samaritan priest. And I wish that there was more stuff like that, really kind of digging into the life of this community. And
also Midhat's relation to that is both like, I don't think this is real, but I also do think this is real. Yeah. So like there's like a cool kind of relationship that he has with it that's like unresolved.
But I think that if she'd done that, then Midhat being a bit more of a cipher would probably work in her favor. Like he could be this kind of mysterious, ambiguous presence. But the fact that we spend so much time, like, if not looking over his shoulder, in his head, the fact that he feels like such a cipher, that he feels like such a non-entity in so many parts of this book, feels like a weakness. But it feels like she is kind of constrained by this kind of first-person realist way of doing things that
emotional hyperliteracy
has to feel like so tied into it, like you said, like emotional awareness on this very like surface level, that she just kind of can't abstract herself enough to make maybe the more interesting choice.
And I mean, and when you're describing this, it kind of sounds like a first novel where you're like, you know, your voice is kind of like between how you've been trained and like what you're going to do eventually. Because like I was reading a little bit about Enter Ghost, and it sounds like she makes some more interesting choices in terms of like style in that book. But yeah, I think I agree with you, John. I agree that there's kind of like you can see moments where she's kind of stepping outside of the frame she's kind of conducted, or, you know, not the frame, but the form of the book she's decided to write.
Yeah. And I definitely want to check out that new book at some point. I don't know when I'm going to get around to it, but that sounds like a little bit bolder in terms of what she's choosing to do.
Yeah, and like the characters will even like do scenes from Hamlet apparently, that sounds cool. So
maybe it's just my inner Shakespeare guy, but sounds cool.
So one thing I wanted to mention, John, because again, and it might just be the thing that we said it's a little unresolvable, is when Midhat is hospitalized, a character asks, is Midhat sad about Palestine? And Gita, the grandmother character, who is one of the best characters, sort of laughs and says yes. And so, but I also wasn't sure. And I was like, so at this point, if a character says, as Midhat said about Palestine, does Hammad think that Midhat's madness is in some way a stand-in for the fraught relationship Palestine has with colonizers? Or is that an attempt to kind of juxtapose the two without connecting them? Do you think that's the case? Do you think something else is going on? Because like when the character says it, Tita sort of says, sure, yeah. Like she thinks it's sort of like a child speaking truth unintentionally. But is that what the author wants us to think, or is it something else? Because I don't know if I know. So I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a tough question. And part of me feels like, again, given like, I don't know, part of me, when I originally suggested this book a couple months ago, obviously we'd already seen a lot of horrible stuff out of Gaza, but it's been like 4 months since then, and it's just been kind of an unending parade of horrors. So I almost feel a little unqualified to say.
Yeah,
but,
that's a good point. Yeah.
No, but I still think I'm gonna try to say something. If not like definitively, I'll at least try to like say something as a critic. And I think that at the end of the day, I think the part of the, like, again, I think it comes back to this fundamental issue with, again, the fact that presumably this is based on true events. Presumably,
right.
Isabella Hammad's great-grandfather was in a cycle ward, for some length of time in the mid-1930s.
Right.
And I think that there's something that just, I don't think she is quite able to bridge the attempt at like political, not allegory, but political metaphor with the real events of history in a way that feels totally useful. Because as I was reading this book, and I could be wrong here, so if I am, someone please tell me. So I think that Midhat kind of having this mental breakdown is kind of supposed to be a metaphor for the way that, again, kind of he is like a subject. He has this dual consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so he can't commit enough to the struggle to fully participate. And maybe if he, again, not necessarily him as an individual, but like, let's just say he's a stand-in for sort of this bourgeois Palestinian subject who maybe was not able to get involved in the struggle fast enough for it to matter.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of what she's saying. It's like he basically spends like this whole uprising like semi-catatonic in this psych ward because he can't leave behind like the colonizing world and like fully commit to being part of this nation.
Yeah.
But then as I'm reading it, I'm like, I don't feel like a strong enough case is made that there was a different route for history to take. As soon as like we're kind of at mandate Palestine, as soon as like they basically Britain gets control over the Palestinian territory, and it's made pretty clear kind of from the jump that they're going to side with the Zionists.
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't really ever feel like there was another way for history to go. And I don't know enough about the actual history of that time to know if I'm sure there were points where that could have been different. Yeah. But I don't think Hammad portrays those points in a way that makes Midhat's like dithering feel consequential.
Yeah. And along those lines too, John, that sort of reminds me of that thing we were talking about with historical novels that pick like fixed sequence of events. And I was saying like, the determinism kind of comes in because I feel like if you were going to present like a counterfactual history, that would be like a kind of different novel. And instead it's just sort of like this sort of inevitable progression. And to me, like, as you were saying, I almost read it as like, yeah, I mean, experience is diverse. There were people who were probably on board and people who weren't, and Midhat just happens to be someone who wasn't. But that also, to me, doesn't explain the like question: is he sad about Palestine? And it's sort of just like, well, I don't know. Like, I mean, he's sad about Jeanette. And so like in the final scene when he has that confessional scene we talked about, he more or less just forgives his father for withholding the letter. So then to me, that makes him think that his conflict is about his father and not sort of political. So it's like there's political conflict, there's familial conflict, and they're kind of all superimposed upon each other, but like they don't quite all match up in a certain scene or a certain event.
Yeah, I think that for me it just keeps coming back to that fundamental fact that she's trying to do two things and she can't quite blend them in a way that makes them more than the sum of their parts. Like, I feel like there's two levels this book is working at, and they just always remain like oil and water. Yeah. And there are parts I like about both parts of the book, but at the end of the day, like, it never comes to this, again, the way that I think something like Middlemarch does, where it really kind of comes to this greater whole that makes all those different parts really sing together.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm mixing my metaphors, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, yeah. I agree though, because I think I liked reading it. I didn't love it, and I think sort of the way the two parts didn't quite match up, I think I'm with you on that. And I think to me, like, is Midhat sad about Palestine? I think is one way to frame how they don't quite add up. Because like I don't know if I can answer the question. I think like while on some level that's fine, in another way, like a more sort of harmonious thing would kind of like we'd be able to know if they matched up or if they didn't.
I mean, on one level, like, is Midhat sad about Palestine feels like such an on the nose way to ask that question.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
It almost feels not quite artless, but it's so blunt. You know, again, it's a little bit like, again, when he finds the notes.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I get what we're trying to do here, but it's so on the nose that it just kind of, I feel like I'm getting hit over the head a little bit.
Right. Yeah. And then, T to the grandmother's like, sure. Yeah. Like, but, yeah, I don't know. It was it's an interesting book. I am glad you picked it, John. I think it's something I wouldn't have read otherwise. So yeah. I'm glad to have read it.
No, I'm glad I read it too. I think that like I said, I'm very interested to like check out her other book. I definitely think she's talented. Like, she clearly has some chops at writing. I think it's, whether or not she's quote unquote successful as a novelist in the future is going to come down to leaning into her strengths and shoring up her weaknesses. But I guess she's
apparently working on another book. She's working on another book that's set in like Indonesia and India, I think.
Interesting.
So she's like, I think she's taking a swing in the interview I found at like a different subject. Okay. Which also sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, I could see definitely not wanting to get hemmed in as being like exclusively the Palestine novelist. And obviously telling Palestinian stories is very important, more important now maybe than ever before.
Yeah.
But also, artists should be free to pursue whatever they want.
Right. Yeah. And I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I had something and it just disappeared. I don't know what it was. Yeah. It was something about, I can't remember what.
Listeners, Ben and I are both very hot tonight. The temperature in the Midwest United States shot up dramatically the last week, and we're struggling a little bit.
Yeah, we're sweating in our podcasting chamber within the Infinite Library.
Yeah, we can't get the crackling wood fireplaces turned off, so we're steaming.
Yeah, I like the idea that like the wood place, like you have to wait for this cycle to enter for it to turn off, and it's not quite in the cycle, so we're just stuck with a roaring fireplace.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this one. Definitely a little different than episodes have been in the past. I would say if this book sounds interesting to you, give it a shot. Despite the length, I found it pretty brisk reading.
Yeah, me too.
Kind of, yeah, which I always think is a good sign. So, yeah, definitely worth your time if it sounds interesting. I definitely, like I said, I'm interested to check out her other books in the future. But yeah, definitely a book. Probably my least favorite thing we've read for the show thus far. But there's some real stiff competition for like the what we read.
We read one of the path-breaking historical novels. And then, so
it kind of feels almost a little hard to compare this again. Somebody's debut to like Middlemarch or again the Fraud, which was written by probably one of the best novelists like of the century. So I can't hold it against her.
Yeah, we can't hold it against us about her first novel. Reminds me of a quote. I think like somebody asked Warren Zevon about Bob Dylan, and he just goes, "Well, he's the reason I have a job." So it's like yeah, the we read some pretty top tier stuff, and I think it, the Parisian is still worth reading despite our somewhat reservations that we might have. So
yeah. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining me this week.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, John.
Listener, we hope you'll join us again here in 2 weeks. We're going to be reading Blithe Spirit.
It'll be some nice dessert for this season, I believe. So
yeah. So that should be fun. Looking forward to it. So until then, free Palestine.
Free Palestine.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you like our show, subscribe or Spotify podcast. You want to follow us on guy at Library Pod. If you'd like to contact her directly with good ideas or email us librarypod. Our intro music, Legend. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs. Logo was created by Lars. You can support our show by supporting them. Hope you'll join us back in the stacks for episodes soon. December books. Heads.